And welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today we are joined by Dr. Stephen Fedorowicz, who will be presenting on a primer on deaf communities in Japan, identity, sign language, and diversity. Dr. Stephen C. Fedorowicz is a cultural anthropologist, visual anthropologist, and associate professor of anthropology in the Asian Studies program at Kansai Gaidai University. His areas of interest include deaf communities, sign language, ethnographic photography, multimodality, performance, and globalization. He has lived, conducted research, and taught in Osaka, Japan for over 25 years. To read more about Dr. Fedorowicz and his work, please go to the YCAP's website and read his complete biography. Dr. Fedorowicz, it is so great to have you here with us today. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's get started. All right, thank you everybody for coming out tonight or this morning, wherever you might be. So my name is Stephen Fedorowicz, and this presentation is on my long-term research of over 25 years of, deaf culture, deaf cultures. This includes my PhD dissertation work with 3 years of field work, especially in the Kansai area. My early focus on deaf culture was the shared group and individual identity of deaf people based upon their sign language use and efforts to fight against discrimination and prejudice by the hearing hegemony. I employed street-level ethnographic methodologies to gather data and explore these issues with various deaf individuals and groups. But I began to wonder, is there a single deaf culture in Japan or even in the world? So then what about using the term deaf cultures to take into account different countries and geographic locations? Over the years, my research and perspectives have grown and changed to the point where I now use the term deaf communities to take into account not only geography, but different kinds of identities, sign language use, diversity, and intersectionalities. So with that introduction, let's begin with deafness in Japan. An overview. So there are an estimated 350,000 to 400,000 hearing impaired people in Japan. These are people who are registered at their local governments as disabled. They receive a disability notebook that identifies the type of disability and ranks its severity. The ranking in part determines the amount of social welfare assistance the individual can receive. There are various levels of hearing loss among deaf people. Some have residual hearing and can hear high-pitched sounds. Some are able to hear low-pitched sounds. And there are other physical circumstances that combine with individual situations. Some people are born deaf. Some are born deaf with deaf parents in the so-called deaf family. Some are born with hearing parents. Some become deafened later in life, some are hard of hearing, and some are multiple handicapped, deaf-blind, for example. These circumstances influence identity, attitudes, and communication styles. So welcome to Deaf World in Japan. And this illustrates the diversity and sometimes intersectionality of deaf communities in Japan. And I should mention, unless it is listed on the slide, these are all my own original photographs. And so in this collage of photographs, you could see deaf people that are part of a deaf family. You could see deaf people that are the only deaf person in a hearing family. Some people who consider themselves to be hearing impaired and can speak for the most part. Some are foreign and deaf. Some are deaf and other disabilities, so deaf and with cerebral palsy or deaf and blind. There are hearing people as well that could do sign language that work to support and help teach with the deaf people, and others who work as interpreters. There are members of deaf who are LGBTQ plus community. And here we also have some deaf baseball players and a deaf professional wrestler to boot here. So with some of these communities, we are using the term these days, intersectionality here. Sugimoto has called these kinds of communities multiply disadvantaged. Lane calls them double minorities. Mr. Kim, in an interview from my dissertation, refers to it as a double burden. And from my friend and scholar Yamamoto, she started talking about intersectionalities with deaf in Japan. So intersectionality emerges from Black feminism in the United States in the late 1980s. And so with deaf people, just because you're deaf doesn't mean that you're all the same. People have different circumstances. So deaf is a minority status, and if you happen to be foreign or a member of LGBTQ or other things, you've got different kinds of lifestyles, you've got different problems. And so there really isn't a sameness, a homogeneity within the deaf world in Japan here. And so let me throw this out at you now. So not all deaf people are deaf. Do you get that? Do you see that? What is the difference between small d deaf and capital D deaf? Well, let me try to explain for you. So with that, I'd like to say that deafness entails much more than hearing loss. Academics and now Japanese deaf people themselves present two models of deafness, a deficit model and a cultural model. So the deficit model, and in disability studies, it's sometimes referred to as the medical, individual, or illness model, treats deaf people as disabled, handicapped, abnormal, and needed to be treated, rehabilitated, and or cured. Advocates of this model work on behalf of disabled people to provide social welfare services because the deaf are seen as unable to do such things for themselves. Aristotle is quoted as saying, "Those born deaf become senseless and incapable of reason." Early psychological, sociological, and linguistic literature perpetuated these deficit ideas until the 1970s, with broad assumptions that deafness decreases cognitive ability and increases behavioral problems. Such literature associates deafness with traits like disobedience, immaturity, unintelligence, undeveloped personalities, creating stereotypes based upon unusual and unrepresentative case studies. It was only in the 1960s and 70s that sign languages were acknowledged as real and bona fide languages. This model tends to encourage prejudice and discrimination. The cultural model or social model from disability studies treats deaf people as a cultural group and or linguistic minority. Nothing is necessarily lacking in these people. Rather, they use a form of language that is visual rather than oral. This cultural model can be seen as a social movement originating in the United States and spreading to other countries, including Japan. The capital D in deaf serves as an empowering device that marks these people as a cultural group, similar to the capital J in Japanese people, a capital B for Black people, and capital LBGTQ in LGBTQ plus communities. To be culturally capital D deaf in Japan entails a sense of belonging in the Japanese deaf world, using Japanese Sign Language as one's first language, marrying another deaf person and ideally living in a deaf family situation, and struggling with discrimination and prejudice from the dominant hearing society. So getting to that small d deaf and capital D deaf, the use of small d deaf refers to the so-called hearing loss, the physical condition. And so in this case, not all small d deaf people choose to be capital D deaf. To do this involves a conscious decision and acceptance into the capital D deaf community. This decision also influences the language form used by individuals. And so you could see in the deficit model, there's something called sign Japanese. And in the cultural model, there is Japanese Sign Language. I will talk about those two things in a little bit more detail in a couple minutes. It also determines the kinds of affiliations that one might have, both nationally and locally. So small d deaf might be parts of the Japanese Federation of the Deaf. And with that, think of the deafness as a disability and think of sign language as merely a form of communication like Braille rather than a real language. For capital D deaf, they might belong to deaf culture advocate groups. And their philosophy would say that they feel themselves to be bicultural and bilingual. So they're capital D deaf, but they're also capital J Japanese. And they're bilingual if they use Japanese Sign Language as their first language, but they still need to use written Japanese to function in society. This is Ono Sensei from Meisei Gakuen in Tokyo. He's also an NHK Sign Language news broadcaster, and he travels around Japan giving lectures on deaf culture and deaf issues. And here you could see him using these models and terms. So in terms of the deficit model, here you could see this long string of complicated kanji, chokaku shogaisha, which would be small d deaf or hearing disabled. On the cultural side, we have the term ro or rosha, so for capital D deaf or capital D deaf people, and then with the note that Japanese Sign Language is the mother tongue. And so we could start to define Japanese Sign Language as the visually based language used primarily by the deaf in Japan and maybe by a few hearing foreigners as well. So going back to my dissertation research, I would ask what is the most important aspect of deaf culture? And it was always the use of Japanese Sign Language. Sign languages are not universal. So Japanese Sign Language is different from American Sign Language and so on. America, Great Britain, Australia, they pretty much speak the same language, more or less, English, but their sign languages are different. So different country, different language, different culture, different language. And so we could see some of these differences in this World Federation of the Deaf map, the legal recognition of national sign languages. And so you could see many of these different countries that have their sign languages and the legal recognition. So for example, in Japan, coming from 2011, is a country with sign language recognition as part of disability legislation. We could also see the differences in sign languages from the sign language family tree. And so we have some of the major sign languages that influenced other sign languages going back in time, American Sign Language and French Sign Language, for example. If we look at Japanese Sign Language, probably the origin, the birth of a standardized Japanese sign language goes back to the Meiji period when deaf children were coming together with the establishment of the first deaf school in Kyoto in 1878. Japanese Sign Language has influenced Korean Sign Language and Taiwanese Sign Language because of the colonial background back when Korea and Taiwan were part of Japan. The sign languages are about 60% similar. It has also influenced Myanmar Sign Language as well due to the efforts of deaf people, deaf Japanese people with development projects in Myanmar. So Japanese Sign Language is different from Japanese. It's different, of course, in terms of modality. It's also different in that it has its own grammar, word order, and more often these days, I'm including worldview. So Japanese deaf people using Japanese Sign Language think differently than hearing Japanese who speak Japanese. Japanese Sign Language is, of course, more than just hand shape, its placement, orientation, and movement. Really, sign languages are all body languages with the use of non-manual signs, other body parts, and especially facial expression. Facial expression is important for nuance and emotion and feeling, but it's also part of the grammar of Japanese Sign Language as well. Imagery and classifiers are very important too. So with Japanese Sign Language, there is a system of finger spelling that is used called yubimoji. It's not part of the natural language. It's something that's used in conjunction with Japanese Sign Language. You could also express the Chinese characters kanji in Japanese Sign Language. there are regional differences or dialects. And so most of my study and most of my time has been in the Kansai. And so I tend to do mostly Osaka Sign Language, which is a little bit different than Tokyo Sign Language and Sign Language in Hokkaido and Kyushu and other places as well. Even places close in proximity, like Osaka and Kyoto, for example, have sign languages that are slightly different. We see gender differences in the use of Japanese Sign Language as well. So men might sign in a masculine form, women might sign in a feminine form. And I'm of the belief that we are seeing the formation of non-binary forms as well. There are generational differences. So old people sign differently from younger people, middle-aged people, and children. Children are probably the hardest for me to understand because they sign so quickly, and they've got all of their slang as well, So what are these young kids talking about these days? I just can't understand what they're doing here. And there are polite forms in Japanese Sign Language and keigo as well. So all of these qualities should not be a surprise linguistically. We see the same sort of things in spoken Japanese as well. So as I mentioned before, there are two forms of sign language in Japan, and with many pidgins and varieties in between. Japanese Sign Language, or Nihon Shua, is the sign language that capital D deaf people use amongst themselves. It's seen as their mother tongue, a natural language. Recently has been codified, analyzed, and described in standard linguistic terms by Japanese deaf linguists. Sign Japanese, or Nihon Taio Shua, is the sign language used by hearing people, some small d deaf people, some hearing impaired people. It follows the same grammar and word order as spoken Japanese. Often Japanese is spoken along with the signing, and such a thing is really impossible when you are doing Japanese Sign Language. So as signed, Japanese lacks all important facial expressions and classifiers found in Japanese Sign Language. Capital D deaf people often find it confusing. For them, the meaning, nuances, and the relationships between imagery and reality are absent in Sign Japanese. Most sign language interpreters used Sign Japanese rather than Japanese Sign Language. And here's Ono Sensei once again, and he's talking about different sign language use in the news and media, especially since 3/11, the earthquake, tsunami, nuclear incident time. And so from that time, we started seeing press conferences from the government, and we would see the sign language interpreter in a larger box or sometimes standing side by side with the government official, which is a good thing, but they are typically using Sign Japanese. Ono Sensei at 311 was the only deaf broadcaster that could get to the NHK studios, and so he was working long and hard hours. And with the emergency information coming in, he was literally looking at the Japanese on the teleprompter and then interpreting it into Japanese Sign Language for the viewers. So I know this is complicated, and so I'd like you to think of the difference between Japanese Sign Language and Sign Japanese with something like this, right? And so I'm borrowing and modifying this from an American deaf comedian and his website, Deaf Like Me. So Japanese Sign Language as being more interesting and expressive in terms of both linguistics and capital D deaf culture. Okay, so now I would like to move to some recent actions, events, and moments. And we could start with this in 2013, Tottori champions sign language. And so the Tottori Prefectural Assembly adopted an ordinance recognizing sign language and requiring the prefectural and municipal governments to develop environments to promote its use. It was the first ordinance in Japan to officially recognize sign language, stipulating that sign language is a cultural product that has an independent linguistic system. The ordinance also urged business operations to provide comfortable working conditions for people with hearing impairments. Since that time, there's been a whole lot of other local sign language ordinances. And so in the purple boxes, this is on the prefectural level. And so 38 out of the 47 prefectures have prefectural sign language ordinances. The boxes with the orange boundaries have local ordinances, either by wards, cities, towns, or villages. And so as of May 2024, there is now a total of 536 municipalities that have sign language ordinances. However, there is still no national law. Two deaf politicians were successful. In 2015, Yanetani-san in Hyogo Prefecture is capital D deaf, and you could see her giving a speech in Japanese Sign Language with a sign language interpreter. Saito-san from Tokyo's Kita Ward Assembly does not use sign language. She relies on reading and writing for communication. In 2019, two severely disabled candidates won seats in Japan's upper house, and another one won a seat in 2022. And this is very encouraging, and they're doing important things in Japan's upper house. In 2016, we have this new law bans bias against people with disabilities, but shortcomings exist, say experts. So this is the law to eliminate discrimination against people with disabilities. And this is really, really important. And it's huge because it is the only national law that bans discrimination against anyone. There are no national laws to ban discrimination against women, minorities, foreigners, LGBTQ+. So this is really, really important. The goal of this law is to make life easier to some extent for the nation's 7.8 million people with disabilities. It bans unjust discrimination and asks government agencies and private businesses to take reasonable accommodations to remove social barriers. Japan signed the United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability in 2007. It took them 7 years to actually ratify it, and then another 2 years to enact it, supposedly for public and private sectors to prepare. In terms of the shortcomings and limitations, it's really important, but it definitely isn't as overarching or as powerful as, for example, the American with Disabilities Law in the United States. But every year or so, we see amendments and revisions, and so it is getting popular. But very few people seem to know about this or understand the issues. The private sector entities are asked to strive to take action with barrier-free, but no real penalty other than small fines if they don't, right? So this is the good news. This is the really bad news. So Care Home Massacre probed as mercy killing in 2016. This was Japan's worst mass murder in post-war history up until 2019. And so this took place at a care home for people with disabilities in Kanagawa Prefecture, 19 dead and 26 injured. And so the guy who did this said he was trying to save people with multiple disabilities, especially those with communication problems, and he had absolutely no remorse. He said these people have no point in living, and that he had to do it for the sake of society. They were a burden on society and the social welfare system. These people provided no contributions to society. And he said his influences in this kind of thinking were Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump. The scarier thing, perhaps, is that many people agreed with him on social media in terms of people with disabilities being a drain on money and resources, especially with Japan's lowering birth rate and aging society. Let's go to another positive one now, and this was the Paralympics that was supposed to come to Japan in 2020 as an agent of change, and lots of big goals for this, including accessibility and universal design along the lines of barrier-free, shifting the mindset about disabilities. You know, so if you really don't have a disability or a family or friend that's disabled, you really don't have much experience and understanding. And so it's easy to fall into the deficit model. So here, the idea of shifting the mindset and having an inclusive approach in discussions and decisions so that disabled people can participate and make decisions on their own. Support at the workplace and from business, and promoting education in schools and the media. And then finally, sport as an agent of change. So disabled athletes coming from all over the world can get together. People could watch these incredible athletes doing their stuff. Okay, so next I want to share with you some selected deaf spots. So this is the Sign With Me Cafe in Tokyo. The owner is deaf, as are the workers and most of the customers, and so they are using sign language. And so here, if you can't do sign language, then you would be considered the disabled one. You can use the menu, point to the menu, and write things as well, so you could still communicate. They got really great soup. Right? This is a deaf snack drinking establishment in Ginza in Tokyo with a deaf mama-san bartender and most customers. It's fun, but it's a very expensive place to drink and do sign language. This is deaf political activity in Kyoto, working to get equal social welfare for Zainichi Koreans. This is deaf LGBTQ plus in Osaka Pride Parade. This is the nonprofit organization Deaf Support Osaka, holding a bazaar during the Golden Week Festival. This is Deaf Support Osaka's Deaf Cafe, probably what they are best known for, and their popular Friday night cafe that has alcohol and snacks. This is Nihon Shua Atelier in Hirakata-shi, Osaka. This is a rare kind of sign language circle created by capital D deaf people for capital D deaf people to spread the use of Japanese Sign Language and promote deaf culture. And this is an example of a deaf school in Osaka. There are a few of them in Osaka and one close by in Kyoto. Every once in a while, I have the opportunity to go and give a guest lecture to these students, and it's just a whole lot of fun. These children have never met a foreigner before, usually, and especially a foreigner that can communicate to them in their own language, and so it's a lot of fun. And I'm very happy to do this. And so there's a lot of great stuff going on in the deaf world in Japan. There are lots of deaf lectures about Japanese Sign Language and deaf issues. There are deaf filmmakers doing really cool things. There's a rich theater scene throughout Japan. There are really funny comedy shows that go on, entertaining pantomime and puppet shows. And usually this is all done in Japanese Sign Language without any spoken Japanese interpretation. And pretty much all of them showcase deaf culture and deaf issues. And so getting to my conclusion, returning to these two models, they're presented here as opposites, binary and either or. And I must admit that if I was doing this presentation 10 years ago, it would have been very different. For most of my career, my research focused on capital D deaf and their Japanese Sign Language. I was and am a proponent of the cultural model, and I don't hide this bias. I wasn't so interested in disability studies per se. I didn't see the people I was studying, many of whom became very close friends, as disabled or deficit. But due to many factors, both on the societal level and my own personal circumstances, I began to examine disability included more and more in my classes and publications. And when it comes down to it, even if a capital D deaf person doesn't view their self as disabled, society does, and they have to deal with it. In reality, there's a large amount of overlap between these models in the real lives of deaf people, making the situation and issues much more complex than I've been able to describe in the last 30 minutes. But I hope we can continue the discourse with your comments, questions, and discussions. Right? So, arigatou gozaimashita.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fedorowicz, for your wonderful presentation. and also giving us some very good talking points. So to quickly start off, I do want to mention if you haven't already, please put all of your questions into the chat, and from there I will read them to Dr. Fedorowicz. So my first question actually is, could you give us an example of what Japanese Sign Language looks like for those of us who've never seen it signed before, please?
Yes, I can. And thank you for that question. It's something I usually include in a lecture like this, but um, cut for time. So I was hoping I would get this question, right? So maybe if you could make me the only image on the screen so you could see the sign language a little bit better, right? Okay, so this is an annotated version showing some differences in sign language. And so I have experience with sign language in Bali, Indonesia, a little bit in America, and of course a lot in Japan. And so since I'm an anthropologist, let me show you some examples of kinship and gender signs. So in Japan, the sign for man is this. This is man, right? You know, this is oya yubi. It's the parent finger or thumb, right? The sign for woman is this, right? The small pinky finger, right? So among hearing people, this is a gesture, and it has maybe a slightly risque meaning, you know, so you are at the izakaya and your male friend's smartphone rings and everybody's going, ha, 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 you know, is it your girlfriend? Is it your mistress? But in Japanese Sign Language, it's woman, right? In American Sign Language, the sign for man is this, man, literally male person. The sign for woman is this, female person. So in American Sign Language, the signs for men are associated with the head. The signs for women are associated with the mouth. Do you know why this is? Is it because men think and women talk? Now, don't get mad at me. I didn't make this up, right? There's lots of discrimination in lots of languages, but that's just one from American Sign Language. In the Balinese Sign Language, the sign for man is this. It should actually be a little bit lower, but you can't see that part of my screen, right? You get it, right? The sign for woman is this, right? Again, that should be a little bit lower, but you can't see that part on the screen, right? Hi. Okay, so getting to Japan, and I think just for time, I'm just going to focus on Japan and signs for family. So you've got father, you are rubbing your index finger lightly against your cheek, father, and you have mother, right? Mother, right? Right. So the sign for sister, again, is this, right? How do you know this is sister and not woman? It depends on context for the most part, right? This is older sister, this is younger sister, right? So you've got father, you've got mother, you've got sister, and this means brother. This means older brother, this means younger brother. This means how many brothers do you have? Right? So notice the facial expression, right? So there's a difference between Japanese Sign Language talking about brothers and an American, right? Sort of thing. You know, so different cultures, you know, have the different languages, whether it's spoken or signed, you know, based on, you know, their culture and different interpretations of the body as well. Right? いいですか?
Thank you so much for those wonderful examples. I'm, if you don't mind, I would actually like to also ask, if it's not a problem, what does signed Japanese versus Japanese Sign Language look like? Because you showed us the picture, and so I'm assuming there's, you know, a little bit more um, flair, excitement, I guess. I'm curious if you could give us a quick example of those two, please.
Okay, I could try. I'm not very good at signed Japanese here, right? And I'll just do a brief introduction. And so I will say, you know, my name is Stephen, right? And so I'll start with signed Japanese. And signed Japanese is expressed this way, so literally this finger is Japanese and this is the sign Japanese, and they are the same. It's seen as the same, right? And so in sign Japanese, and this is hard because there's no facial expression, so I have to just go, right? So literally that was watashi no namae wa, and then I finger spelled suteibun des, right? I can't do it well, but I mean, really, there is no facial expression. It uses particles, it's very slow, and you would be speaking Japanese while you were doing it, right? In Japanese Sign Language, it would be more like, right? So literally, it is my name, what? And then here I'm using my sign name. This is my sign name for Stephen, for me. And so no particles, no use of des and facial expression. There are those kinds of differences. And so deaf people seeing the interpreters on the news or on TV or other places, sometimes just don't get it because it doesn't really match the image of reality. And for interpreters on TV, if they're doing sign Japanese, sometimes they would just say, just give us the captions, that's better. So I hope that helps.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's very interesting to see a visual representation of the two. So to dive into our questions from our audience, so Patricia Yarrow asked, I wonder how Japanese Sign Language works. Is it katakana with katakana or kanji?
Right. So with finger spelling, and this is not a natural part of Japanese Sign Language, but you can do kana in finger spelling. There's no difference between hiragana and katakana, so that's a good thing, right? But it's not natural, and actually, the modern form of finger spelling goes back to the 1930s. The story is that Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf, visited Japan and saw the system that they were using, which was not just fingers, but whole arms and body. And it was just kind of odd, especially if she had to feel that to understand what it was, and suggested that they look at the American system. And so a group of teachers and researchers from Osaka went to America, checked it out, came back, and devised this system of finger spelling that we have now. There are some similarities with the finger spelling in ASL, but of course there are more kana characters than alphabet letters, and so we have to uh, deal with that. Kanji is very important. Early on, older deaf people would actually finger paint or paint on their hands kanji characters, but there are signs for kanji. And actually, I studied Japanese Sign Language before I studied spoken Japanese. And so I learned a lot of my kanji through sign language. Right. And a lot of it makes sense, right? So for days of the week, right? So you got Monday, Moon Day, right? Tuesday, this is the sign for Fire Day. Wednesday is water. Thursday is tree. Friday is gold, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the kanji are matching the imagery of what the kanji represents.
Thank you so much. So to kind of transition into kind of specific areas in society that perhaps do or don't utilize sign language, Hiroaki Nakanishi asked, do you happen to know if sign language is used in military forces, for example, like in the Japanese Self-Defense Forces or even the U.S. Army or U.S. military?
That's a great question. I can't speak of any of knowing about sign language use in the self-defense forces, and I've never really thought about that, but that's something I would be curious into looking into, and maybe I will. Um, in the military in the United States, they used to have very strict requirements saying that, soldiers could not be deaf. And there's a story about a deaf college kid in college, and he wanted to go to ROTC, and they wouldn't let him because he was deaf, and he kept trying and fighting it. And finally, they did let him in, and they let him into the military. And I forget what rank he was, but he also assisted other deaf soldiers as well. So I know that exists in the United States. Can't talk about Japan, but that would be interesting to find out.
Thank you very much. Um, so to kind of transition out of the military, but kind of staying in this, within various communities, um, Jeff Maziata asked, so you mentioned about a deaf pro wrestler. Would that happen to be Heat Up Dojo in Kanagawa? He said, I know they do a lot of work with supporting disabled communities.
Um, no, this was an older guy from Japan, and I'm blanking on his name right now because I haven't seen him for a while. Right, but if you remember those photos from that collage, you could probably tell which one he was.
Thank you so much. This is a question, not a question, sorry, a comment, not really a question, but Peggy Konda said, I'm surprised at the small number in Japan when you referenced around 400,000 people in Japan are hearing impaired. I would like to follow that up with specifically in schools, how are students accommodated? If there's, assuming a smaller number of students who are hearing impaired, um, how are kids accommodated at school? You mentioned about some schools specifically for students who are deaf or hearing impaired, but specifically, what about, like let's say a local school has just one or two students. Do they have someone there to, is there like a specific class for them, or how does that work?
Right. Yeah. In terms of the number, it's declining because Japanese population as a whole is declining, right, with the older population and the lowering of the birth rate. And so we're seeing fewer children, that includes deaf children, being born. Many of the reasons why people became deaf early on are no longer a problem because of advanced medical things, and so those are some reasons why the number is so small and decreasing. We could also see evidence of the decrease by the fact that the number of deaf schools have been decreasing as well. So maybe 10 years ago, there was maybe 100, 104 deaf schools, and now there are maybe 90. And now they are starting to call them special needs schools with deaf and blind and physically disabled people there. Um, Many deaf kids sometimes will be mainstreamed into regular hearing schools. And if that's the case, sometimes they have a special class a few times a week, to help them pick up Japanese and help them speak as well. So Japanese deaf schools, so if there's a kid in a community and his community doesn't have a deaf school, oftentimes they will commute. So the deaf school I'm most familiar with is Ikuno in Tsuruhashi in Osaka, and so it's not uncommon for a kid to have an hour or more commute to go to that school, right? Um, Deaf schools in Japan are based on oral education. There was actually a law that was in effect until the late 1990s that made it illegal to use sign language in the classroom at elementary schools. And so they spend a whole lot of time trying to teach children how to lip read or speech read, and then also how to speak and how to pronounce. And they spend so much time doing that these kids often fall behind 2 or 3 years in academic subjects compared to their hearing counterparts. There's only one deaf school in Japan, and that's Meisei Gakuen that I mentioned before. in Tokyo that uses Japanese Sign Language as its language of instruction. So they employ a bicultural, bilingual approach to education. Half the teachers are deaf and, of course, use Japanese Sign Language. The other half are hearing but can use Japanese Sign Language. It's an incredible school. I heard a story about a student that actually lived in Hiroshima, and she commuted every day by Shinkansen to Shinagawa to go to that school. So yeah, that's pretty incredible, right? So I mean, it's hoped that we could establish these other schools in other parts of Japan as well. I hope that helped with the question.
Yeah, but that's wild that her only choice was to take a Shinkansen every day. That is,
It's a great school.
that's wonderful, but it's terrible that it's not in the distance because as a child, I imagine that must be a lot to, you know, that must be quite a trek every day, you know.
Mm.
Um, but thank you so much for answering that question. The next question comes from Jeff Maziata asked, uh, uh, in reference to your comments about Japanese slang, that's very interesting. How does this work? How does Japanese slang work within um, sign language, Japanese sign language?
Well, I mean, it works pretty much the same way that it works, in hearing societies. If there's a popular entertainer, and especially if they have popular gestures they use in comedies or something, those get incorporated into the repertoire at that time, and then of course they become shigo, they die out, nobody uses them anymore. And these kinds of things, so it's pretty much, the same way. So when I started teaching in Japan, it was, I think a golden age of comedy with gestures, and so sometimes I still try to use those in my classes. And of course, my students don't have any idea what I'm doing, like the nande raro, you probably don't know what that is, right? But I mean, these kind of gestures, and they find themselves, into deaf culture and deaf people's language uses as well. And deaf people use gestures too. I mean, just because they're using their hands, it's not, limited to the language. They will use the same kind of gestures that hearing people use in their repertoire as well, right?
Thank you very much. The next question comes from, and forgive me for if I mispronounce your name, uh, Ala Raziki Dushanta. Hello, warm greetings from Indonesia. In here, there are two forms of sign language, signed Indonesian, and BIS in INDO or Indonesian Sign Language. A lot of hearing teachers seem to still use signed Indonesian despite critics from deaf people regarding signed Indonesian. So I wonder how the current situation is in Japan in terms of sign language usage in schools.
If there is any sign language, it's signed Japanese. And a part of this goes to the philosophy of the Japanese Federation of the Deaf. They are the oldest and the largest, organization for deaf people. They've done a lot of really good things, and so I'm not criticizing them on that level, but they're very inclusive in terms of what they think of what deafness is. And so it's primarily small d deaf, some capital D deaf, hard of hearing, deaf and later in life, all of them are sort of lumped together. And they are of the opinion that, sign Japanese is the major form of sign language in Japan. And this is what they use. And of course, the Japanese government and educators, when they're getting information about these kinds of things, they're going to the Japanese Federation of the Deaf. And so they are getting information about sign Japanese. Unfortunately, most people, when they go to their local sign language circle to learn sign language, it's signed Japanese. And they aren't told, and they don't even know that there's another form. And they don't find this out until they meet a capital D deaf person and they can't understand what that person is signing, right? So the system is, really unfortunate. And I think it's the same way in many other countries. I worked in Bali for a summer back in 1995, and actually was a small village in the northern part of the island that had a large number of deaf people due to a genetic mutation. So that was my first experience with deafness. And some of the deaf kids would go to the deaf school in Singaraja. But of course, they were using signed Indonesian, and they didn't understand that, and so they would quickly come back to the village, and use their native sign language, which is known as kata kolok. Right? So, thank you for the greeting from Indonesia.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from Vivian Ning. AI transcription has made it easier for people speaking Japanese to have their words transcribed into written form so that they can be understood by people with hearing difficulties. Is there any work being done to visual capture Japanese Sign Language and transcribe that into written Japanese?
Yes, there is, and so I think on our smartphones, we could have these apps that when people speak, it turns into text, and Japanese deaf people can take advantage of that. NHK, for example, has been working with CGI so that they could have interpreters at events without having real people there, using AI and this sort of thing. And actually, they're doing a pretty good job because they are basing it upon a real capital D deaf model, and it includes facial expressions and these kinds of things. So, yeah, I think there is that kind of work going on. You hear about other things that, well, here's a glove that you could wear and it will translate sign language, into text, or but that doesn't work because it's just not about the hand, right? The facial expression is really key in sign language, so that's a great challenge. But I'm sure they're making lots of technological advances in that sort of thing. Probably my students know more about that than I do.
You very much. To kind of stay within this context, so Hiroaki Nakanishi also wants to ask, in the time when AI and digital assisted communications are getting dominant, what kind of debates on how to use Shua or sign language are ongoing, positive or negative, or encourage in using the express emotions by hand gestures?
Well, capital D deaf people, no matter what is going on in society or what's going on with technology, are never going to be willing to give up their language, and they shouldn't have to give up their language. But on the other hand, they are great to adapting to the new technologies. So a few years ago, when we all had to start using Zoom for classes and remote meetings and this sort of thing, Zoom wasn't so good with sign language and other things. But due to the efforts of deaf people and other disabled people, a lot of the things that we take for granted now on Zoom, were suggested and developed by some of them, and so deaf people have been very savvy with the technology and being able to use Zoom, to do their remote meetings and workshops. It's a whole lot better now. Pre-COVID, I used Skype sometimes, and the sign language. It was really hard. You had to sign slowly, and you had to do it just in a certain space. So it's really come a long ways, and I'm sure it's still going to go a long ways as well, but not to the point where they're going to be giving up Japanese Sign Language, Nihon Shua, their language.
Thank you very much. With reference to COVID, David Green wants to ask, can you explain about the effect of common use of masks in Japan and facial expressions, and perhaps how that affects the deaf community?
Yeah, that was really, really tough. Even before COVID, during, allergy season, people would wear masks, and sometimes deaf people would wear masks during those times, and it's like you're not seeing half of the face, and so you're not getting half of the message. and so that was difficult. And so with COVID, it became even more difficult and even more challenging, and so that was probably one of the reasons why, they were really trying to improve Zoom, for remote meetings where they could be separate but still be able to communicate, without the blockage of the mask. Some people use face shields. I tried to do that in a class, but of course it fogs up and I can't see what's going on. Some people made masks that were made out of plastic or just plastic in front of the mouth. Again, those fogged up oftentimes, and people really got the wrong understanding of what those were because they thought it was clear in front of the mouth because Japanese deaf people can lip read and speech read, but that isn't the case. It was more for showing facial expression and whatnot, and so a lot of people were making these kinds of masks on behalf of deaf people so that they could better lip read and speech read. But there's a really great misunderstanding about the difficulty of that, especially in Japanese when there are so many homonyms in spoken Japanese. So COVID was tough. I mean, everything was closed down. The sign language circles, the meetings, and stuff. And so that also really affected my research with deaf people because I could not be with them.
Thank you so much. We're running out of time, but if it's okay, do you have time for just a few more questions?
Oh, sure.
Okay, thank you so much. So the next question I wanted to ask is from um, Tom Gill. Can you update us on the situation with cochlear implants, please?
Um, yeah. There's a great film from back in 2000 called Sound and Fury about a family, two families that they intermarry, and they both have deafness in the family. And one of the couples, um, they are capital D deaf, and they have deaf kids, and their oldest deaf daughter wanted a cochlear, and they were very much against that. The other side of the family, they were both hearing, and one of the twins that they had was deaf, and they decided to go with the cochlear, and so there was a lot of arguments and problems within the family, and it's a fascinating film. There's an update 6 years later. There's a TED talk by that woman. And so those are interesting things to look at. Technology changes. Cochlears are probably getting better. The problem in the early days with cochlear is that for them to be effective, you have to implant children when they're young, like 3, 2, 1, several months. And that's a huge decision that a parent has to make. And the reason is because that's when kids, are picking up language. So if you implant an adult that's never heard these things, it's really not going to do them a whole lot of good, right? Um, and they encouraged parents that if their kids did get a cochlear, not to use sign language because it would be seen as a crutch and they wouldn't be able to develop spoken language, right? And of course, in hindsight, we know that's crazy because people are bilingual all over the place, right? And so I have friends who are deaf that have kids that do both sign language and speak Japanese. That's not a problem. My daughter speaks Japanese and English and a little bit of sign language. That's not a problem. So that has been changing. So we see in some of the sign language circles, parents of deaf kids actually coming in and making the effort to learn sign language. Right. There are other technologies, so a cochlear doesn't work all the time. And so they have other things that work. And they're doing some genetic things as well with deaf kids. Capital D deaf people still have a problem with this because it seems to them that they are trying to eradicate deaf people and their culture and their language. And that might be hard for hearing people to understand, but they really feel that way, and even with all, the new technology and all the advances, again, it boils down to they don't think they have anything wrong with them. Right? They have their language. They can communicate. They could do pretty much anything everybody else can do except perhaps hear. So they don't need to be cured. They don't need. And, if you get a cochlear implant, you shut it off, you're deaf, you turn it on, you're hearing. but are you really? I mean, what is your identity? You know, what are you once you get the cochlear? You know, so these kinds of issues as well.
Thank you so much. And our final question comes from William Cleary. What do the police do when they arrest a deaf person?
Um, Back in the 90s and early 2000s, sometimes police officers would come to sign language circles, and the one that I was a member of and did most of my research with, there was a cop there learning sign language, and at some koban there would be a sign in front that said, you know, that there's at least one police officer that can do sign language. You really don't see those signs anymore, right? And so these days, I think it's rare that police officers, you know, learn this. You know, if they do, and if like doctors and nurses learn it again, they're going to be learning the sign Japanese version rather than Japanese sign language. So at best, they're probably trying to communicate, you know, using the smartphone, using iPads, right? You know, there are interpretation services that you could log into. There'll be somebody who does sign language and can interpret the sign language into spoken Japanese and vice versa. So I think, and I would hope that those technologies are being used by law enforcement.
Thank you so much. And this concludes our Q&A session. I apologize that we went over and we weren't able to answer completely all of them, but we tried to answer as much as we could. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you so much to our audience members who have stayed with us over 8 o'clock. I apologize. To conclude, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Fedorowicz, for your time and taking time out of your day to be with us today. We really, really appreciate it. This was a very interesting presentation. And additionally, I think it's really nice to see, you know, the visuals as well as understand a little bit more about society in terms of sign language and Japanese sign language. So thank you so much.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so everyone, once again, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you once again, Dr. Fedorowicz, for your time. And we hope you'll join us next time for the next Getting to Know Japan webinar. As I posted in the chat, if you would like to read more about Dr. Fedorowicz's publications, research, or even his reading recommendations, please follow that link. And we hope that we'll hope to see you next time. Thank you. FadTech's IT support and mobile internet service helps make events like this one possible. Thank you.